So first, let's just do a really quick recap of Alan Shaw's work on affect regulation. And you'll remember that we talked about Shaw's work in describing early brain development processes involved in affect regulation. So the development around the limbic system, the right hemisphere of the brain, and particularly the amygdala. But in addition to these things, which we haven't talked about yet, Shaw also explored some of the key aspects of parent-infant interaction that underpins the early neurological organisation and development of the affect regulation system. So really what he was talking about was, how do these train tracks get laid down? And in particular, Shaw has focused on interactions using eye contact from around about 8 weeks of age. And this is the age when Shaw identifies there is a rapid increase in the activity in the visual cortex of the baby's brain. And what he says specifically, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit just to sort of make a little bit more plain. And what he says is this: with the maturational advance at 8 weeks of age, the mother's emotional or facial expressions become the most potent stimulus in the baby's environment. He gains an intense interest in her face. The infant's gaze, in turn, evokes the mother's gaze, thereby acting as an interpersonal channel, which research indicates essentially lays the track work, the neurological organisation of the baby's brain. So here Shaw is really suggesting that this eye gaze is, as we've highlighted there, the most potent stimulus in the baby's environment. He gives a similar emphasis to the role of the mother's voice and language as the auditory centres of the brain begin to mature a bit further on. Now there's no doubt at all, that Shaw's work has probably been as important and influential in our understanding of early infant development as John Bowlby's in working through attachment theory. However, I think what's interesting about Shaw's research, along with most of the research on affect regulation, which is where his expertise sits, and probably a lot of attachment theory based research generally, is that most authors, if anything, only give a cursory mention about the role of touch in this early development, and they give much more emphasis to eye contact and language. So, if you were going to read a lot of attachment research, you may already have, you would be forgiven, I think, for thinking that affect regulation and attachment are mostly, if not totally, dependent on eye contact and facial expression, with other interactions involving physical contact between parent and child being of little or at least a sort of only incidental or sideways importance. But this doesn't actually make a lot of sense. If early affect regulation is weighted around visual input of the parent's facial expression and later on language, then what we should expect to see are higher rates of attachment and affect regulation difficulties in children born with hearing or visual impairments who can't access this stimulation. But all of the available evidence about attachment in children who have hearing or visual impairments is that these impairments on their own don't contribute to any of these babies having any better or worse social and emotional outcomes from a neurological perspective compared with children who have normal hearing or vision. Certainly children who have disabilities can be at higher risk of attachment and regulation issues, but they're often associated with more relational issues, not the actual impairment itself. And so what this really hints at is that there might be something else going on that extends beyond the visual and the auditory input that the baby receives. And likewise, I think, if eye contact and mutual gaze themselves were more important than any other type of interaction as affect regulation develops, then I think we'd also expect to see poorer outcomes in children from cultures where there are lower periods, lower frequencies of eye contact. But this, however, has been demonstrated not to be the case. And indeed, in some cultures where time spent in eye contact and mutual gaze is relatively low or lower, affect regulation outcomes are sometimes better. So what's going on here? Well, even Shaw himself acknowledges it's not simply the act of eye contact. It's not simply the mechanics of speaking or the facial expression itself that seems to be important. What Shaw does clarify, and certainly the research indicates, it's the way that these expressions between the baby and the mother help them synchronize and match and feed off each other. And that's what appears to have the key impact. There have been some studies done with fathers as well with similar results, but the research with fathers is much less invested in. So how do we define this matching? What do we mean by this synchrony? Well, Feldman defines this synchrony as a match between a parent's and infant's activities that promotes positivity and mutuality, which helps regulate infant attention, facilitates the development of verbal dialogue, there's that verbal reference again, and promotes the infant's capacity for regulation. Mutual synchrony exists when both partners simultaneously adjust their attention and stimulation in response to each other's signals. Well, in plain English, what this is really telling us is that the important part of parent-baby interactions are not so much the mechanical interaction, as I said, the task of making eye contact, the task of talking words, but the extent to which they occur in a rhythmical, a back and forth swing. In other words, if we're supporting early emotional development, it's not something that can be done to a baby. It's something that takes place within the context of an interaction and a conversation between two people. And there's now mounting evidence, which we're going to look at in more detail, that suggests that it's actually touch that plays a crucial role in enabling this backwards and forwards, this synchrony, to actually happen. So, look, it might be important from a research point of view, but from a practitioner point of view and from the point of view of dealing with parents and babies, I guess, in real life, I don't really see any practical or useful advantage to trying to work out or say, well, touch is more important or eye contact's more important or voice is more important or less important. I think in the real world, what we have to see is that all of these things co-occur and are all important to infant development. But it does raise the question of why touch specifically is relatively invisible in the attachment and the affect regulation literature. And of course there are some exceptions to that. So in our next topic, we're going to look at the research that suggests that while eye contact and voice help make up the words of a conversation between parents and babies, it's actually touch which seems to give these words their meaning.